You ever heard about the ancient ritual where thousands of people gather in the desert, each one of them hurling stones at a wall? Sounds like some primal, savage behavior, right? But this isn't just any old rock-throwing contest. We're talking about the devil himself. In Islam, there's a mysterious rite called Rajm, where pilgrims ritually stone the devil during the Hajj pilgrimage to Mecca. It all starts on the 10th day of the month of Dhu al-Hijjah, when Eid al-Adha begins. This festival is more than just a celebration. It's about Abraham's willingness to sacrifice his son for God's mercy. As a part of this ritual, pilgrims throw 7 small stones at Jamrat al-Aqaba, one of the 3 stone walls in the Valley of Mina. But here's the thing. Tradition says this is where Abraham stoned Satan himself. Now, you might be thinking, what's so unusual about people throwing stones? Well, it gets more interesting when we talk about the specifics. The stones are supposed to be natural, not broken from larger rocks. No precious stones or gold and silver allowed. And when they're thrown, they should be done with care. Nothing too violent or big, just enough to get the point across. But here's what really gets under your skin. There are 3 jamras in total, each one pelted with 7 stones every noon for 3 days straight. So we're talking about thousands of people throwing hundreds of stones, all aimed at this entity, this creature called the devil. It's like a primal scream against evil itself. Now you might be wondering what kind of stones these are. And let me tell you, it's not just any old rock collection. These stones come from nature, found in their raw form, so to speak, nothing polished or altered. And once they're used for the ritual, they take on a new character, sacred, almost. If someone finds one of these stones outside the pilgrim's area, forget about it. That's considered grave theft. You'd think this would be enough to drive the devil away. But remember, this is more than just a physical act. It's an emotional and spiritual experience for all those involved. The real reason behind this ritual isn't just to stomp out evil. It's also protection, shielding the pilgrims from harm once they leave the pilgrimage site. You see, in Islam, when you perform Rajm, you're not just throwing stones at a wall. You're casting your doubts and fears into the void. It's like trying to exorcise your inner demons. And for those who do it with conviction, the impact is real. They feel cleansed of all that negativity. In the desert of Mecca, this ancient ritual takes place on hot days where the sand-scorching sun beats down relentlessly. It feels almost surreal when pilgrims from around the globe come together to throw stones at Jamrat al-Aqaba, an act so steeped in tradition and history, a true testament to how rituals can be both mesmerizing and scary. It might seem like just another strange custom to outsiders, but for those who participate or observe this ritual, it's about letting go of the burdens you carry inside. So what does Rajm look like when performed? It's the stones flying through the air, each one carrying a piece of your worries and anxieties, cast away into nothingness. Now imagine, on the 11th day of Dhu al-Hijjah, thousands of pilgrims standing side by side at Jamrat al-Aqaba. It's not just about throwing stones. It's about the resolve to let go of your doubts and fears, sending them into the void as a form of surrender. And then there are those who perform Rajm every noon for 3 days straight. They throw 7 stones each time, never stopping or looking back, an act that symbolizes their commitment to change and letting go. It's like standing at a crossroads, choosing between what you were yesterday and the unknown tomorrow. So when we talk about Rajm, it's not just some peculiar tradition. It's an act of defiance against evil itself, casting your doubts, fears, and worries into the void, leaving them there to wither away. You know what they say, when in Rome, do as the Romans do. But have you ever heard about the medieval punishment that was more like a public humiliation than a correction? A time when the pillory stood tall, a gruesome reminder of the consequences of crossing the powers that be. I'm talking about the Marlborough pillory, an ancient structure that was once a common sight in English towns. It's hard to imagine now, but back then, this wooden contraption was used to shame and humiliate those who broke the rules. The pillory was essentially a cage with holes for the head and arms, where offenders were locked in to face the wrath of their fellow citizens. Let me take you back to 1861, when Llewellyn Jewett wrote about this very same pillory in his article The Reliquary Quarterly Journal, I stumbled upon an old woodcut engraving that shows the pillory in all its grim glory. It's a haunting image of a punishment device used for centuries, with offenders being subjected to verbal abuse and physical harm. But what's even more chilling is the history behind this medieval practice. The pillory dates back to Anglo-Saxon times when it was known as heels fong or catchneck. In France, they called it the pillory, a name that sounds almost innocent compared to its brutal purpose. As you'd expect, the punishment was reserved for the most heinous crimes: dishonest trading, libel, sedition, and even counterfeiting. One man who fell victim to this practice was William Prynne, a critic of Charles I and the Anglican Church before the English Civil War. In 1649, he was sentenced to stand in the pillory for seditious libel, had his left ear cut off, and branded with the letters SL on his cheek. The humiliation was complete. Prynne's name became synonymous with the brutality of the Marlborough pillory. But this wasn't an isolated incident. In nearby Devizes in 1615, Nicholas Powell was convicted for deceiving John Smithy with false letters. He was whipped in the open market until his back bled, and then set upon the pillory, with a paper sign on his head announcing his crimes. You see, this was a time when public opinion mattered more than justice itself. The Marlborough pillory was a tool of social control, designed to maintain order by inflicting pain and humiliation on those who dared challenge the status quo. Today, we might view this practice as barbaric and outdated, but back then, it was simply the way things were done. As you walk through the streets of Marlborough today, it's hard not to imagine the pillory standing tall, a grim reminder of the power dynamics that once ruled this land. The Marlborough pillory is a relic of a bygone era, a testament to the darker aspects of human nature. It serves as a warning about the dangers of unchecked authority and the importance of safeguarding individual rights. So next time you hear someone say, "When in Rome," remember the Marlborough pillory, a haunting reminder that even in our own backyard, there were once punishments so brutal, they'd make your skin crawl. And it's not just limited to one place. There's evidence that this kind of punishment was used in other Wiltshire towns. It was an era when social control and justice often walked hand in hand with humiliation and pain. But what's most striking about the Marlborough pillory is its connection to our own history, a reminder that even as we move forward, we must never forget where we came from. As you walk through the streets of Marlborough today, take a moment to imagine the pillory standing tall, a gruesome reminder of the consequences of crossing the powers that be. It's a testament to the darker aspects of human nature and a warning about the dangers of unchecked authority. And who knows? You might just catch yourself thinking twice before you do, as the Romans do. You know what's even more unsettling than being trapped in a nightmare? Knowing that there are methods of execution that have been used throughout history to crush the very life out of people. I'm talking about death by crushing or pressing, a technique so brutal it'll make your skin crawl. Let me take you back 4,000 years to ancient South and Southeast Asia, where elephants were used to trample humans to death as punishment. Yes, you heard that right, elephants. The Sasanians, Romans, and Carthaginians also dabbled in this gruesome method on occasion. It was as if they wanted to inflict the maximum amount of pain and suffering possible. But it wasn't just the animals that were used for this sinister purpose. In ancient Rome, a young maiden named Tarpeia betrayed her city to the Sabines, thinking she'd get away with it scot-free. Instead, she was crushed to death on the very rock that now bears her name, the Tarpeian Rock. As we journey through time and geography, we find ourselves in pre-Columbian America, where the Aztec Empire also employed crushing as a method of execution. The Mongols were no strangers to this brutal practice either, often viewing it as a more humane way to put someone out of their misery without shedding any blood. But here's the thing. Death by crushing wasn't just some ancient relic. It was also used in common law courts under a system known as peine forte et dure. It was essentially torture by weights, where stones were placed on a person's chest until they either pleaded guilty or succumbed to suffocation. This was done to coerce people into admitting their crimes and submitting to the court's jurisdiction. The dates are staggering. This practice has been documented as far back as the 13th century in England. Imagine being trapped under a pile of heavy stones, unable to breathe, with no way out but to plead guilty or risk suffocating under the weight of the law. This isn't some dry historical account. It's a chilling reminder that human beings have been capable of inflicting unspeakable cruelty on each other for thousands of years. The techniques may change, but the desire to crush and oppress is timeless. As we explore this dark chapter in history, remember, you're not just reading about ancient civilizations. You're witnessing the echoes of brutality that still resonate within us today. There's something that'll make your skin crawl when you hear about it. The practice of blowing people from cannons. It sounds like a horrific relic from a bygone era, but trust me, it's all too real. It started in parts of southern and western Asia, where the British were trying to establish their authority, especially during the 19th and early 20th centuries. The region was plagued by weak governance, rebellion, and banditry, the kind of chaos that makes you wonder how people survived back then. And amidst this mayhem, the cannon became a tool not just for war, but also for punishment. In British India and the princely states, the practice of blowing from a gun was most infamous. It involved binding a condemned person to the front of a cannon, essentially turning them into a human projectile. The blast would rip their body apart, sending them flying in all directions. Yes, you heard that right. It was a gruesome way to meet one's maker. But here's the thing. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a broader practice across southern and western Asia, where other states employed similar tactics. In Persia and Afghanistan, for instance, execution by cannon was used primarily in civilian contexts. These places were in turmoil, with power struggles, wars, and banditry making life unbearable. Let's take the case of Persia. During this period, the state was struggling to assert its authority over a chaotic landscape. Bandits roamed freely, and there were numerous rebellions against the government. The authorities turned to the cannon as a means to send messages to these would-be rebels. If you cross us, this is how you'll meet your end. The British, on the other hand, adopted the practice from their Mughal predecessors. They used it primarily for military discipline, but there were cases where they employed it in civilian contexts too. The first recorded instance of execution by cannon in India was in 1808, when a British officer named Charles Canning executed a man as an example to others. Now, you might be wondering why we're dwelling on something so dark and outdated. Well, here's the thing. This wasn't just about punishment or maintaining order. It was also about psychological warfare. The authorities were trying to intimidate potential rebels by demonstrating what would happen if they dared to challenge the state. The technical details of how this was done are chilling in their own right. The condemned person was tied to the front of a cannon, usually with each arm bound separately. Then, they'd be detonated with a massive blast that could rip through flesh and bone like paper. This wasn't just about killing. It was about spectacularly displaying power. The Mughal Empire had used this method long before the British arrived on the scene. In fact, they were so fond of using cannons in public executions that they even kept a special arsenal for the purpose. The Mughals believed that this form of punishment served as a deterrent to would-be rebels and made it clear who was in charge. But here's what makes this practice all the more sinister. It was done with relative frequency, especially during times of war or when there were rebellions against the state. In British India alone, there are records of at least 50 people being executed by cannon over a period of several decades. That's not an isolated incident. That's a pattern of behavior that suggests this practice was integral to how authority was maintained. And yet, despite its brutal nature, execution by cannon became a normal part of life in parts of southern and western Asia. People grew accustomed to seeing others meet their end in such a gruesome manner. It's a sobering reminder that the rule of law can sometimes be brutal, especially when those who wield it are desperate for control. So there you have it, the grim tale of blowing people from cannons. It might sound like something out of a horror movie, but trust me, it's a piece of history that'll haunt your imagination long after I'm done telling this story. You know what they say about the darker side of human nature? That we're capable of greatness, but also of unspeakable atrocities. And one of those atrocities is something that's been a part of our collective psyche since ancient times: capital punishment. I want to take you back to ancient Greece, where the laws of Draco were put in place around the 7th century BCE. Now, I know what you're thinking. What kind of person would create laws that call for the death penalty for even minor infractions? But here's the thing. Those laws weren't just about punishment. They were also about maintaining social order and keeping the peace. It was a time when cities like Athens were facing massive problems with crime and violence. And so, Draco's laws were designed to crack down on that, with some pretty harsh penalties, I might add. For example, stealing a goat could get you killed. Yeah, that's right. If you stole someone's animal, the consequences would be severe. But what's interesting is how this idea of capital punishment evolved over time. In ancient Rome, for instance, it was used not just for murder and treason, but also for things like adultery and blasphemy. And in the world's major religions, including Judaism and Christianity, there were passages that seemed to justify or even prescribe capital punishment. Take the passage from Genesis 9 verse 6. Whosoever sheddeth man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed. That sounds pretty clear-cut, right? But here's the thing. It wasn't just about killing someone in cold blood. It was also about maintaining social balance and ensuring that justice was served. And then there was this concept of lex talionis, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, which appeared in the Babylonian Code of Hammurabi. That's the idea that punishment should fit the crime, but what happens when it gets taken too far? In Japan, during its peaceful Heian period, 794-1185 C, it was customary for the emperor to commute every death sentence and replace it with deportation to a remote area. But once civil war broke out in the mid-11th century, executions were reinstated. And if we jump ahead to Islamic law as expressed in the Quran, we find that capital punishment is indeed prescribed for certain crimes like murder and treason. But there's also this nuanced approach, where punishment is tailored to fit the crime, but not always with a focus on killing the offender. Now, I know some of you might be thinking, wait, what about all those times when capital punishment was used as a tool of oppression? When it targeted certain groups or individuals based on their race, religion, or social status? And that's a valid question. Because yes, history shows us that capital punishment has often been misused and abused. But here's the thing. We can't just dismiss the whole concept without understanding its historical context and how it evolved over time. We need to acknowledge both the good and the bad, because that's what makes this conversation so complex and so necessary. The ancient Greeks, for example, were known for their philosophical debates about justice and morality. And one of those debates centered around the idea that some crimes are so heinous, they deserve the ultimate punishment. But was it just a form of state-sponsored killing, or did it serve a greater purpose? As we continue to grapple with these questions today, it's essential to remember where we came from, and not just in terms of capital punishment, but also in our understanding of justice itself. Now, I'm not here to tell you that one side is right and the other is wrong. What I want to show you is how this complex issue has evolved over time, with its share of successes and failures, twists and turns. And as we explore this further, let's make sure we keep it personal. Because when we talk about capital punishment, we're not just discussing abstract concepts. We're talking about real lives with families, friends, and loved ones who've been impacted by the justice system. This isn't just a historical account or an intellectual exercise. This is about humanity, our capacity for both good and evil, and how that plays out in the way we treat each other. So let's dive deeper into this complex world of capital punishment. Let's explore its roots, its evolution, and its impact on us as individuals and societies. Because when we do, I think you'll find that it's a story worth telling. One that reflects our deepest hopes for justice and our darkest fears about what happens when we lose sight of those values. Let's start with the basics. Capital punishment is the use of death as a form of punishment by a state or other authority. It's been used throughout history, across cultures and continents, to punish crimes ranging from murder and treason to adultery and blasphemy. One of the earliest recorded instances of capital punishment was in ancient Greece, where Draco's laws introduced harsh penalties for even minor infractions. In Rome, it was used not just for murder, but also for crimes like adultery and blasphemy. And in many major religions, including Judaism and Christianity, there are passages that seem to justify or prescribe capital punishment. But here's the thing. This concept has evolved over time, sometimes with tragic consequences. Take Japan during its Heian period, 794-1185 CE, where death sentences were commuted to deportation instead of executions. But once civil war broke out in the mid-11th century, that practice changed. In Islamic law, as expressed in the Quran, capital punishment is indeed prescribed for certain crimes like murder and treason. However, there's also a nuanced approach, where punishment is tailored to fit the crime, but not always with a focus on killing the offender. Now, let's get into some of the historical context. When we talk about capital punishment, we're discussing real lives with families, friends, and loved ones who've been impacted by the justice system. It's essential to acknowledge both sides, the successes and failures, twists and turns. Capital punishment is a complex issue that's affected millions of people across history. And when we explore it further, let's make sure we keep it personal. Because this isn't just an intellectual exercise. It's about humanity, our capacity for good and evil, and how that plays out in the way we treat each other. As we delve deeper into this world of capital punishment, I want to ask you a question. Where do you stand on this issue? Do you think capital punishment is an effective tool for maintaining social order? Or is it a form of state-sponsored killing? Let's explore these questions together, with empathy and understanding. Because that's what makes this conversation so important. You know what's even more unsettling than a dark and stormy night? A history that's been shrouded in darkness for centuries. But tonight, I want to take you on a journey through the twisted tale of corporal punishment, a practice so brutal, it'll make your skin crawl. It starts with a simple yet sinister principle: an eye for an eye, and a tooth for a tooth. This was the mantra of ancient Babylonian law, which decreed that those who committed crimes should suffer precisely the same injuries they had inflicted on their victims. Sounds fair, right? Wrong. For in this brutal world, punishment wasn't just about rehabilitation. It was about revenge. In those days, corporal punishments were as common as the sun rising over the horizon. From flogging to branding, beating to blinding, the list of agonizing methods was endless. And let me tell you, it wasn't just a matter of, oh, look what they did in ancient times. No, this practice continued for centuries, infecting society like a deadly virus. Take, for instance, the case of Delaware, where floggings were still practiced as late as that's right. In a country that prided itself on freedom and justice, physical punishment was still being meted out to those who dared to break the law. And even when it was abolished, the echoes of pain lingered on. But Delaware wasn't the only one guilty of this heinous crime. The United Kingdom, once hailed as a bastion of democracy, had its own dark secret: whipping. Yes, until 1967, British justice still prescribed the lash as punishment for certain offenses, a practice that would make even the most hardened individual wince. And then there's the Middle East, where Islamic law still permits the gruesome amputation of limbs. In this region, beatings and floggings are still a regular part of life in prison, a grim reminder that human rights mean nothing to those who wield the power. Now, I know what you're thinking. This is all ancient history, isn't it? But no, my friends, corporal punishment may be a relic of the past, but its echoes can still be heard today. Prisons worldwide are still using beatings and other forms of disciplinary action, often with the full knowledge of the authorities. But here's the thing. This practice is not just a historical footnote. It's an affront to humanity itself. The United Nations has spoken out against corporal punishment, recognizing its inherent cruelty and inhumanity. And international conventions on human rights have explicitly prohibited it, a testament to our collective desire for justice and compassion. So as we delve deeper into this dark history, remember that the fight against corporal punishment is far from over. It's a battle we must continue to wage, both as individuals and as societies. For in the end, it's not just about punishing those who break the law. It's about recognizing the inherent value of human life, a lesson that ancient Babylon never learned. And so, let us honor this legacy by choosing compassion over cruelty, mercy over punishment. Let us strive to create a world where pain is no longer meted out in the name of justice, but rather in the pursuit of healing and redemption. That's a world worth fighting for. one that will give us all something to be proud of. Now, I know this has been a tough tale to tell, but I hope it's also given you food for thought. Because when we confront our own demons, that's when the real transformation begins. So let's keep pushing forward together. For in the face of darkness lies a beacon of light, waiting to be fanned into a flame that will illuminate our way towards a brighter future.